our closing keynote speaker, Musonda Mumba. Musonda is the director of the Rome Center for Sustainable Development under the UN Development Program, UNDP, in close collaboration with the Italian government's Ministry of Environment and Ecological Transition. The center focuses on 3 priority areas: climate change, sustainable development, and nature protection. In her role, Musonda provides strategic leadership on these matters through convening, collaboration, connecting, and co-creation as the world navigates complexity and uncertainty with the aim of achieving the UN's Sustainable Development Goals collectively. She is recently the past chair of the Global Partnership on Forest and Landscape Restoration, and just ended her term as vice chair of the Collaborative Partnership on Forests. She has over 25 years of experience in environmental and conservation issues globally, and has published widely in various journals, newspapers, articles, and contributed to book chapters. Before joining UNDP, Musonda was the head of the UN Environment Program's Terrestrial Ecosystem Program and served in various roles over a period of 12 years. A Zambian national, she received her Bachelor of Science in Education at the University of Zambia and her PhD at the University College London in Wetland Conservation and Hydrology. Today, Musonda's talk is entitled Why Multilateralism Matters in the Decade of Action and for the Restoration Agenda. This presentation will be followed by a Q&A session. I encourage you all to use the chat box to type any questions you have during the presentation. Welcome, Musonda. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so very much, Yvonne, for that gracious introduction, and certainly very much for the invitation to speak. You know, I realized it's great to see familiar faces, John and other colleagues there, really wonderful. It's a pity we cannot meet in person, alas. Situation that we're all facing in the world. Good evening and good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm actually currently in Nairobi, and it's just gone after 9:30 in the evening. So if you see my children wandering into here, actually in bed, do not be alarmed. But it's such an honor to really be invited to give this keynote and really to just talk about multilateralism. And I thought I could just take you all on a journey, because I've seen a lot of discussions and conversations on the UN decade, you know, keywords, restoration, recovery, etc. But perhaps it might be useful to just give a little bit of the back end of things as they happen within multilateral processes. I do not want to bore you with a pack of decks or slides, but I will speak as slowly and clearly as I can to just really take you through this journey and really bring you up to speed on where things are and what it really looks like, and why the United Nations as a multilateral process has been so instrumental in making sure that we talk about restoration and certainly recovery, not just of forest, landscape ecosystems, but really just more broadly of the landscapes of which, you know, forests account for a larger part of that. So I want to begin with a really interesting and rather serendipitous moment. In 2018, when I was at the UN Environment Program in Nairobi, we got communication that the Minister of Environment of a rather small country in Latin America was interested in having a conversation with the team at UNEP, and together with a group that is part of the C4 in ICRAF, the Global Landscapes Forum, on an idea that she had. Now, Lina Paul, brilliant woman, who was then the Minister of El Salvador, requested, you know, this meeting. And in Nairobi, as it happened, we were going to be having the Global Landscapes Forum here in Nairobi as a partner and a charter member of that, that UNEP was, and also UNDP is. And so when this meeting was convened here in Nairobi, we obviously brought together a number of ministers who were participating in the Global Landscapes Forum that you all may be familiar with, which isn't quite a multilateral process. The Global Landscapes Forum really is an open process that C4 has curated and is amazing and is just absolutely wonderful and really important in bringing different practitioners, thinkers, etc. Anyhow, on the margins of this Global Landscapes Forum, we had a meeting with, unfortunately, Lina could not travel from El Salvador, but one of the ministers traveled from El Salvador and met here in Nairobi together with our director, our deputy executive director, and also a minister from Rwanda. At that point, President Kagame was the chair of the African Union, and together with the host country, and Minister Tobiko of Kenya. And when I curated that meeting, it was really a moment of discussion to discuss how could we move forward and advance this agenda. And what was exciting was that that meeting happened in August of 2018. By September of 2018, Minister Lina Paul had requested to table that as a resolution in the UN General Assembly in New York. And obviously with friends of the decade. And she said, why do we not have a decade on ecosystem restoration? And I don't know how many of you have actually had a moment to even read that resolution. Yvonne, I'll make it a must that I actually share it if it can be circulated, because that resolution is so important and so fundamental for several reasons, but primarily for one core reason, that in this resolution for the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, the word conservation came before restoration. And hold that thought, I will speak a little bit about the matter of language. That was September of 2018. By the 1st of March, 2019, a resolution was passed in the General Assembly. Now, it was phenomenal in such a short time, where there was a real momentum and agreement and discussion in this space to think, wow, this is so important a topic that we actually should have a resolution that aligns with the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, in this journey, and when you review and read that decade, what you will realize, and when you read the resolution itself, is what you will realize is that all the three Rio conventions, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Convention on Land, UNCCD, and the Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, all those three conventions flagged the importance of conserving all these ecosystems in unity, but also making sure that there's a synergy across all these conventions, what I refer to as Rio conventions, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that because of the poignancy of that. And 2019, when this resolution came into being, I think what was even more poignant was the fact that there was a convention on biodiversity, which was happening in Sharm el-Sheikh, where many African members of state basically flagged and said, we have issues, not just in either dry land ecosystems, in our agroecological systems, but a lot also in our forest ecosystems, where we're seeing shifts and changes and real dynamics. And I feel like they spoke a bit too soon, because not long before that, as we were sort of going towards the end of 2019, something began to happen in the world, a little bit of a tremor, or a little bit of a sort of a sound of something happening. What is this pandemic? Yeah, we hear people are sick somewhere, etc. Anyhow, we all convened and met in that December in Spain for COP25, the 25th anniversary of the Climate Change Convention in Madrid, which was absolutely very critical, with the theme, time for action is now. And at that meeting in Madrid, what was really exciting is the conversations and the discussions that were culminating there. And I was very fortunate enough to moderate quite a number of sessions. And one, a couple that I found so insightful and so important were discussions that, for instance, the indigenous peoples had convened, and really to listen in and just really get this insight on why these ecosystems that were very holistic, that was very, very regenerative, were so important to them. And I also want to mention in 2019 that the IPES report, that intergovernmental panel that looks at ecosystem services, had already flagged that the lands that are mainly managed by indigenous peoples and traditional peoples degrade the least. We see that in Brazil, we see that in many other different places. We see that in space, in spaces here in Africa. We see that in the northern region of Europe, where the indigenous peoples are present. However, in that same month during the COP25, I was also very fortunate to actually moderate a session with the Secretary General of the United Nations. I wasn't so much excited, and don't quote me on this, but I wasn't so much excited about, interviewing Antonio Guterres. I was actually excited about interviewing Luca Parmitano, because for the first time at a climate COP convention, Luca Parmitano, the Italian astronaut and who was the commander-in-chief for the European Space Agency, was streaming in live from space. I was so emotional. I was incredibly emotional that I was thinking, oh my God, I better not cry on this stage as the world, are viewing this man from space, and really have either my mascara washing down my face. And what made me so emotional was that here he was above Earth and telling us, as we sat in that room, and saying, we've just gone past Australia, and I'm just so heartbroken because I can see the fires all over burning. And not so long ago, some days ago, just went over Brazil, and he's describing all of it. And I thought, oh my goodness, here is a man looking down on the planet and thinking, that is home. That's the place I've left my family, people that I love. That is home. But what was also amazing about that intervention was that as he spoke, he started to describe the color of the clouds. I didn't even realize that clouds had colors. I was like, when I look up the sky, I just see these white, things floating above. But he described the color of the clouds and the transition from sea to land. And then he described the blanket of forest, of green. It was spectacular. And in that rather very poetic way of speaking, he just gave so much hope that we can do something about what's happening to the planet, even as he was watching it burning from space. Now that December, everybody returned home. January came in, and I was actually also rather serendipitously also appointed as the chair of the Global Partnership on Forest and Landscape Restoration in Luxembourg. And when we got back home, obviously everybody was excited. 2020 is going to be an amazing year, and we're going to do some exciting things, etc. What happened to the world really is that we went to bed, feeling all very excited and charged, and we're going to do many, many other things. We went to bed in one world and woke up in another. Suddenly, the reality of the zoonotic situation on the planet, something that is very closely related to these very ecosystems that we're talking about, that you've been talking about for these 3 days, forests. And so here we were, suddenly just like deers in flashlights, what's going on? Lockdowns everywhere. I mean, part of the reason we cannot even meet in person, but also at the same time, the awakening, the realization in humanity that we truly did have a fractured relationship with nature. Something had gone so deeply and fundamentally wrong. So for me, what was very interesting in this experience is, even as I, coming into this role as the GPFLR chair, and also just coming out of COP25 and entering 2020, was also a realization that even as we've spoken within the UN, even as UNDP, where I work, about the Sustainable Development Goals, and all these very exciting big words, etc., there was a realization that those very 3 pillars of the SDGs, economics, the social, and the environmental, just came up unhinged. Everything we knew within our social fabrics, our economic structures, the value chains that, supply of the wood that would come from the Congo, or let alone from Brazil or anywhere else for that matter, the food systems that come out of these forest landscapes, and all of these dynamics, everything came grinding to a halt. And also an awakening that how we've managed our ecosystems, or the policies that we've had in place, somehow are problematic. The economic systems, how we trade, and all of that. And I think there was also an awakening and a realization that the absence of systems thinking had brought us to where we were. Now, that was 2020, a bit of a blip, in our history. Everybody like, whoa, okay, what just happened here? Everything was getting postponed. The climate COPs were getting postponed, and all the meetings, holidays, people died. Healthcare systems were affected to no end. the shock with which the world faced all of this. And then as we sort of navigated through all of that, I think there was also a realization that the power of science and how quickly we can come to resolve, even though we're in crisis, was also a manifestation of how we also work within these multilateral spaces, WHO convening, how vaccines can be, basically pushed, and scientists can work overnight to find something that can be helpful for our very existence. We entered 2021, I think, with a little bit of insight and knowledge and realization that things were clearly not okay on the planet, but things were also not very good for humanity, but also the species with which we share this planet with. By the time, some animals were coming into cities, let alone dolphins coming swimming into the, all the canals of Venice, etc. I think people suddenly realized, whoa, there is something that was problematic. The levels of pollution, the fact that even in Delhi, you could suddenly see the Himalayas. I have never been to India, but the realization that I didn't even know that nobody could be able to see the Himalayas, mainly due to the levels of pollution, I was blown away. 2021 came, and with 2021, a lot of multilateral processes came in full throttle. The UK, the United Kingdom, was the G7 president. Italy, our host country at the United Nations Development Program Rome Center, our host, also were the G20 president. And in that same year, last year, both Italy, and rather the stars aligned very beautifully, both Italy and the UK were president and co-president respectively. Now, what was interesting in these multilateral processes is that in the G7, in the G20, and also in COP26, nature featured so prominently in all the resolutions. If you do just a search of the outcome of the G7, nature, restoration, conservation featured. The Matera Declaration from the G20 process, the Napoli Summit Declaration, and the Rome Summit Declaration of the G20, nature was high on the agenda. Restoration was high on the agenda. Conservation was flagged in those, our food systems, rethinking all of that was very much flagged. By the time we were at COP26 in Glasgow, big discussions there in terms of how do we do things differently, but also how do we work with ecosystems, such as forest ecosystems, in making sure that we really are within that 1.5 degree world. Because there are parts of the world in the Sahel, in a number of tropical regions that are really tapering beyond that 1.5. People are already living in a 1.5 degree world. Entering 2022, we're just coming to the end of January tomorrow, but this year, dear colleagues, is a special year because for many of you, you were not even born, but this marks 50 years when the United Nations had the first conference on human environment, looking at human rights and the conjuncture with environment in Stockholm, June of 1972. And this process of convening, of meeting, of discussion and reflection birthed the process of environmental governance, and the first ever United Nations agency headquartered in the Global South, here in Nairobi, the United Nations Environment Program was born. In the same year, the Club of Rome had commissioned the year prior, actually, but they had commissioned a study entitled The Limits to Growth. And that report basically shook the world in 1972 to say, in about 50 years, we're going to hit that limit where we can no longer just take all this resource abuse, how we deal with the planet. We can no longer do what we're doing. And it was very fascinating because possibly the power of this iPhone was the capability of the modeling machinery that they had in 1972. 50 years on. And this same year, we'll be celebrating 30 years of the very real conventions that I mentioned at the very beginning. The Convention on Biological Diversity, the Convention on Climate Change, and the Convention on Land and Desertification. 30 years on. So, as the world enters and comes of age, by the time you're reaching 50, I'm just not so far away from turning 50, but I think by the time you're getting to 50, there's some wisdom that is expected of you and some guidance. And I penned an article just a few weeks ago where I said, you know what? I think this is a moment when you also have to take into account the role of youth voices and why they matter, particularly in the restoration agenda, but also in the recovery process and also in the multilateral process. It was phenomenal to see so many young voices from all over the world really highlighting their challenges and calling out the inaction in Glasgow. And with 8 years, only 8 years to go before 2030. And the motto of the SDGs is leave no one behind. But friends, I must tell you that what the pandemic has done for many countries where us as UNDP work, we exist in over 140 countries. We're present in all those countries and working very closely with governments, with communities, etc. A lot of these places have gone back to 2008 poverty levels. So I shall start closing down and really begin to ask some hard nuts to crack and perhaps maybe just provoke some discussion and some reflection and some thinking, and also an opportunity to just also hear from you and get some insight. You know, one of these questions is, how do we not leave anyone behind? And considering that, you know, we're talking about forests and forest landscapes here, we're talking about the color green, and depending on what shade of green it is and which part of the world you're actually from, how do we really talk about green recovery? How do we recover differently? And also, how do we rethink systems as they are today? The power of language. I was mentioning to a friend a while ago, and I said, you know, in both my both my mother's language and my father's language, my father is from Zambia, my late mother was from South Africa, she was Xhosa, and my father is Bemba. The word to restore, restoration, does not exist because our peoples are and were regenerative, cyclic. And in fact, when you say the word tree in my language, in fact, let's say trees, imiti, plural, imiti, medicine. So when you think about the power of language, and sometimes I feel like the English language doesn't quite do justice. There's so much to learn about the holistic nature of all of these spaces. Activism. I think what has happened in the last few years is that activism has brought up to the fore. Actually, what I love about young people is that for what you lack in experience, you have in drive and force and real courage to just call out some of these elements of inaction. In a few months, well, in about 11 months, the world is going to meet in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, and we'll be looking at COP27. And part of that discussion that will be held there is the issue of loss and damage. A lot of what you've seen with Tropical Anna that has made landing here in Southern Africa is the destruction of ecosystems, lives, and livelihoods. So how do we really look at those elements of recovery when the climate is changing so fast? Before I close, I also just want to mention that 3 days ago, I was giving a keynote at the G7. Germany has become now the new G7 president. And I spoke after Johan Rockström, and it was fantastic to see his points about these elements. You know, he's worked on planetary boundaries, which is fantastic work, and also very, 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 very challenging, and really telling us some of the challenges that we're facing. How do we not go past that 1.5? How do we bring that all of that back? So one of the discussions, perhaps in the questions I may pose is in one of those hard nuts that we're trying to crack is, how do we also bring the whole point of conversation around issues related to forest ecosystems as part of those nature-based solutions to really bring that 1.5 degree level to a manageable solution? What does it cost to actually restore these spaces? What does it cost? Is it really all about money, or is it about also those ecosystem services that we may have lost and are trying to recover, or even those social dynamics? In the words of Vanessa Nakate of Uganda, the climate change activist, she said, if we do not adapt to this climate change, the climate change sometimes results in a loss of culture, a loss of landscapes, a loss of a lot. You cannot reclaim a lost language or a lost culture or a lost landscape. As you go forward in your work, I just want to implore you that even as I want you to remember that the science matters. Science matters so much, because without the science, within the multilateral space, decisions cannot be made. What has been wonderful and exciting within these multilateral spaces, be it the UN General Assembly, be it the convening at the climate summit that happened in New York, be it at the COPs, the climate COPs, or even the Biodiversity COP, which is going to be happening this year, the science has been central, and the realization that without sound science, we cannot know the direction we're going. I want to give you a quote before I go from the Tamil community of Sri Lanka. This is actually from the 3rd century by Avayar. And the quote says, "What you have learned is a mere handful. What you haven't learned is the size of the world." There is a lot to know. There is a lot to learn. So, Yvonne, I think I shall end there, and happy to take some questions, hear some comments, respond to any queries, etc. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Musonda. That was such an amazing speech, and thank you for giving such a great overview of the international space and how forestry and nature-based solution fits in. It was great to hear insights on the new G7 president, Germany, and very excited for 2022 to be the delayed year of nature, is what a lot of people are saying, especially with the World Forestry Congress coming up in May, as well as the next COP27 in Egypt. So thank you everyone also for listening and being here today. So we're going to go ahead and start the Q&A. If you have any questions, please just add them to the chat and we'll get right to them. So the first question is actually going to be from one of the ISTF planning members, Emma, you might know her. She asked, "We know that human health and the health of the natural environment are intricately linked. Do you think this relationship has been sufficiently emphasized in the midst of our current pandemic? And how do we effectively communicate the fact that the state of our environment has direct and indirect impacts on human health?"
Yvonne, I just lost you there for a split second. Could you just repeat the question, please?
Yeah, of course. So the question was, we know that human health and the health of the natural environment are linked. Do you think this relationship has been sufficiently emphasized in the midst of our current pandemic? And how do we effectively communicate the fact that the state of our environment has direct and indirect impacts on human health?
Okay. No, thank you very much for that question, Emma. You know, I mentioned that point about Delhi. And we know that, you know, spaces, for example, in Indonesia, where we as the United Nations have worked tirelessly, especially under the UN RED program, just looking at forest fires and also all those discussions. And what we saw over years is the level of, you know, health asthmatic attacks in children, be it in Singapore, be it in Delhi, be it in all of those spaces. There is an absolute connection between human health and environment. And I think for me, what's poignant is that indigenous peoples have spoken about this for years. for years. And here's what has happened with the pandemic arriving. I think there's been a realization now more than ever that we saw the spikes in India with COVID, and there was a direct correlation between the spike in pollution and also the spike in actual infections. So now one of the issues that we're advocating for within the UN right now is also the issue of One Health. We cannot not look at the health of ecosystems or look at the health of animal welfare, where most of these zoonotic diseases are coming from, and look at the health of the environment, because they're all very intricately linked, and it's a system. It's a functional system. And so, and as you know, with the pandemic as well, what has been very evident is very much that, our food systems are very critical. Healthy and nutritious food is important in the healing process of our bodies. Clean air is important. Rise in temperatures has implications. So the connectivity is so intricate. Now, 2 days ago, and I don't know, for those of you who follow me on Twitter, I challenged one of the guys who he had typed in, brilliant scientist, and I really do respect him. And he had typed in some interesting wording, 1.5 degree, da, 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 da. A lot of the language that we've been using is so, for lack of a better term, quite elitist. It's for us. So we're not even sharing with communities that live in these spaces every day and understand their natural environment. So this element of communication is key. But also at the same time, there's many people who are not environmentalists who just are lost in how we actually communicate this language, or how we communicate the very message of saying you need to eat well, you need to live in less polluted spaces, we need better, greener spaces in our cities, and all of that language that is so everyday life. But unfortunately, this is not very communicated very well. So this element of One Health is now something that has come together, and different agencies, FAO, UNEP, WHO, and many other stakeholders, and something that even the G7 was talking about a few days ago, something that is so critical even in the discussion around restoration. We cannot talk about restoring or conserving ecosystems without looking at One Health. Because if we don't, and we still go back to our silos, and that's why I talked about systems thinking. And I think this is what Club of Rome has advocated for, David Nabarro has advocated for systems thinking. And he's even gone further and said we need better systems leadership, because when we have the systems leadership, how our policymakers understand the structures and the complexity of our systems, then you're able to say, this is the direction we're going to go and resolve this matter together. We cannot resolve it, not a Department of Forestry or Department of Environment or a Department of Health, etc. You cannot dislodge all of these elements. They're all interconnected. Over.
Thank you so much, Musonda. So that, I think, goes well with our next question. This is from Anitra Tharag from Club of Rome, that you did mention. She mentions the book, The Limits of Growth, written by Donella Meadows and her husband, Dennis, on the importance of regenerating the tropical forests, important grasslands, mangroves, seagrasses, marshes, things like that. How do you think this will be accomplished with multilateral resistance and constraints of the 2030 timeline?
Okay. No, thank you so much, Anitra, for that question. So here's what has happened. Unfortunately, there was a period not so long ago when the world was so nervous about multilateralism, obviously. I'm thinking, the world was going into a unilateral space, and that was during the whole, previous American presidency. And people were on edge. People were very, very much on edge. And the very fact that, that the United States was not part of processes such as, the CBD, etc., they were out of the Paris Agreement and all of that. Then secondly, I also want to mention that with the pandemic has also kind of brought us into just the whole issue of vaccines, for example, has brought a space of almost a unilateral dynamic, unilateralism, which was a bit shaky. Now, coming up to Christmas, everybody was excited, October, November, we're going to have COP26, and we're going to go out to Christmas, we're going to celebrate, etc., and bang, Omicron arrived. I mean, we even steered away from just even using the, the Greek alphabet, because suddenly there was an awakening and a realization that unless we have the level of equity, vaccine equity, nobody on this planet is safe. So these variants keep coming, and this, I mean, the science of it. So I think there's an awakening now, even as we enter 2022, and the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, in his report, The Common Agenda, has really called over and over again that we cannot advance towards 2030 without really bringing forward the conversation around multilateralism. Right now, the G20 presidency is with Indonesia, and Indonesia has dedicated a whole cluster of conversation on multilateralism. How do we really go forward and bring everybody together at the table? Because ultimately, we're all on the same planet. Whether you're in a big boat or a tiny boat or whatever, we're in this same storm, but this same storm is affecting people differently. But the only way to do it is to come together. And it's important that coming together happens quicker than we have 8 years. I mean, 8 years is nothing in the scheme of things. It will pass very quickly. And then what after 2030? So are we thinking about the planetary boundaries? Are we thinking about planetary health, etc.? And the bigger question of One Health and all of that, that is important to be at the multilateral table. If it isn't, each country is deciding, yeah, we'll decide when we'll pay for that loss and damage over there, and we'll think about it. And no, it's the coming together. And the G7 presidency flagged this in their strategy, and I'm happy to share that it's actually public on the G7 website. Have flagged that Germany has flagged one of the 5 key pillars of their 5-point agenda is we can only be stronger together. And that in itself is an important message. Over.
That's great, Musonda. And I think this goes well to our next question, focusing on multilateral institutions like UNDP, UNEP, FAO, and World Bank. So the question is from Bob Winterbottom, a fellow at the Global Evergreening Alliance. So he says, as we think about how to do things differently, particularly in terms of rethinking food production systems and improving food security for all, and in terms of improving the effectiveness of programs to restore forest ecosystems, what would you say needs to change on the part of these multilateral institutions?
No, thank you so much for that question, Bob. I think what needs to change, I mean, I may have alluded to that a little bit earlier. I mean, when we had the Food Systems Summit, the UN Food System, in fact, let me go back a little bit. The pre-Food System Summit that happened in Rome, I happened to participate in some of those discussions and conversation. What was very interesting was the centrality of inclusivity in these systems, in these multilateral systems. And so for me, what was very poignant in the conversations that were ensuing in Rome before the actual Food Systems Summit was very much a conversation around the element of inclusion. Now, let's just talk about, let me just bring this home to a continent that I'm familiar with, even though I've worked in many parts of the world. Let's just talk about Africa. So even in Africa, when you're talking about, the actual increase, this is the only continent where the increase in deforestation is quite high, and mainly due to food production. So productive systems that are not sustainable and that are problematic. Now, when you talk about restoration, and I've challenged in some of these spaces, be it whether we're speaking to the World Bank, we're investing in some of these, big grants or loans, et cetera, is when you talk about restoration and you talk to women about restoration, hugely problematic, because the tenure issue on this continent is very complex. In a lot of spaces, women don't own the land. So I need to think, okay, so if I have to restore this space that has been quite degraded and I need to plant, or this community FAO is saying I need to plant 100,000 trees over here. Oh, no, 10 trees, just 10 trees. I don't own it. I may need to seek permission from my husband, maybe from his family, etc., or even from the community, etc. Even the inclusivity. Now, in the space where women even have rights to land, right? I mean, like my country, Zambia, thankfully, I own some land. I'm fortunate enough. Even those mechanisms, and this was at the table in the discussion of the Food Systems Summit, a lot of financing mechanisms are not inclusive. Banks, all these processes, they may have some pink balloons somewhere, or even like a little pink text over there, women, there's this package, etc. they have not included women along the process of these policy changes and processes. So one of the conversations that ensued and emerged even from the Food Systems Summit was very much, let us talk about the inclusion, particularly financial inclusion, that makes sure that it does not disadvantage, youth, women, etc. Now, you spoke about, you mentioned, how do we change some of these systems and processes? Just look at what's happening with Tropical Ana and what's happening in Malawi. Malawi is one of, those countries that is incredibly degraded and where you see a lot of deforestation, etc. One of the questions that's coming up in my mind is, okay, if we're going to talk about restoration where there's been a massive storm, massive devastation of an ecosystem and a landscape, and the World Bank comes in and says, oh, we're going to help you build those bridges that have been washed away. We're going to help you build those hospitals, etc. So is that a grant mechanism or is that a loan mechanism? Because already, this is a country that's already in the red and is pretty much broke, right? So even those mechanisms, and this is why even these conversations around loss and damage within the climate change discussion comes to the table. This is why we have that convening mechanism to come. So even how we rethink these programming. And for me, one of the things that I've been really discussing, even within, this has been a bigger discussion even in UNDP, let's go beyond these very small, tiny programs, 3-year project, etc. How do we look at holistic systems, programmatic and long-term investments? Those make sense. Trees take a long time to grow. Even if it's 7 months, 8 months, that's a long time. It's not like a little grass or a herb that you've planted. It takes time to nurture. And which is why some of these big conversations now in the discussion around green recovery, around restoration, around tree planting is now, let's stop even the tree planting conversation and go to tree growing, because you need to nurture these systems to thrive and to recover, but who pays for that? And so these are the big discussions that are coming up, especially around the intersectionality around food systems, around sustainable food systems, value chains, and all of that as they go forward.
That's great, Musonda.
I see that question from Bruce. Ooh, subsidies.
Yeah. If we want to go ahead and answer Bruce Kernan's question, what role did the UN institutions potentially have in reducing the huge subsidies that are encouraging deforestation? That's a big one.
Thank you so much for that question, Bruce. What was very interesting is, so I was listening into that G7 presidency conference, the kickoff conference that happened on Thursday. And one of the conversations in that presidency was very much a challenge from the civil society, Civil 7, a cluster of civil society groups that are part, not necessarily part of the G7, but, group of civil society groups. And it was impressive because one of the challenging questions that was basically posed to the German minister, Minister Kreischer, was, how do we talk about, value chain, sustainability, and we're using all these big words, and yet the European Union has actually been part of the process of environmental crime, i.e. sourcing 50% of its timber that is illegally logged. Now, this is also a bit of the distortion of these processes, because here we are talking about, this process around the issue of sourcing from not the right source. It's all illegal, 50%. That is incredible. And then at the same time, COP26, there was a whole big declaration, a forest declaration, and whole discussion how we're going to support forests, and very much led by the philanthropic good Bezos F Fund, etc., and all of that, within this multilateral space. Now, what is happening right now within the UN system, and this is also something that we've done within UNDP. So one of the programs within the Rome Center that we've been working very closely with was looking very much into private entities, private companies, Lavazza. Lavazza is a big coffee company in Italy, working with Ely and others and many, many other key stakeholders to really look at deforestation-free commodities. And bringing these these particular entities to the table, because for a long time, and this is what the Italian government has done very wonderfully within the last presidency in the G20, really convening the private sector entities, but also what's happening at sort of the higher level within the European framework is very much that the issue of traceability is actually an issue, huge. The European Union right now is saying anything that will have to show up on the shelves within the European Union has to have that element of traceability. Where is this piece of wood actually coming from? Where has it been sourced? Has it been sourced sustainably if it's coming from the Congo Basin? Where in the Congo Basin? Is it actually coming from Gabon? Is it coming from Congo DRC? Is it the element of traceability is a huge issue. And so these are some of the aspects that we've been working very, very closely with. I mean, working very much with these entities. And then lastly, but not the least, one of the programs that I was very much involved in towards the end of last year within the G20 was the Finance in Common. Finance in Common was bringing together all of these different private sector entities, banks, DFIs, to really be at the table and say, look, a lot of your investments are damaging for biodiversity, especially land-based biodiversity. But this is what it means when this kind of investment is done in the forest. This is what it means when it's done in this particular commodity. We've been in discussions with Ferrero. Of course, people have, eat Nutella. Big discussions around the sourcing of the products that actually go into a lot of things that we eat in our everyday lives. But it's really around this element of subsidies that really the EU has now, I think the element of transparency is key, and this is something that's now very much at the table, and something that is being very much flagged within the G7 and the G20, and something that us as UNDP are really pushing and making sure that these perverse incentives that are very problematic for the very ecosystems we're trying to conserve and protect are really just kicked out of the way. And there's an element of transparency, and that issue of traceability is also very key. Over.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Musonda. Bringing the conversation back to more on the local community and synergies within private and governmental sector with local communities, as well as youth and women. I think Ryan's question on what do you see as the greatest opportunities for synergies between governments, the private sector, and local communities, and combining that with a little bit of Bob's question, and how do you think youth, women, as well as local communities can lead the way in implementing nature-based solutions to restore ecosystems?
Great. Now, thank you so much. I think I'm going to start with Bob's question because then I'll feed into Ryan's question. Thank you so much. Bob, one of the things I did when I was working with UNEP was I founded a network called the Network of African Women Environmentalists. And that was on the 8th of March, literally 7 days after the UN decade had been passed in the UN General Assembly. 7 days, 8 days on International Women's Day, I set up this network. Why did I really, and I brought together different agencies and different sort of, thinkers and programs, but more importantly, women from different communities from across Africa. I was very frustrated that every time some high-level person spoke, they spoke about us or people that look like me in abstract. Women make up 60% of the growers of food, and women, who are these women? What do they look like? What are their names? And where are they actually doing this growing? And where is it easier to grow? Because when you talk about somebody in the Sahel dealing with a 1.5 degree world, there's some things that have stopped growing. And so what options of adaptation are there? And so to Ryan's point, and responding to you, Ryan, is, so when we talk about as UNDP, when we're talking about investments in a specific program, for example, the Sahel, for example, is a flagship program for the UN decade. When we talk about that, the element of inclusion in the entire planning process for everybody, women, youth, disabled people, marginalized communities, indigenous peoples, pastoral people, as we know in a lot of these spaces, it's important that they're included in these conversations. So one of the things that I did, we had a Global Landscapes Forum in Ghana in 2019, where I had requested both the UN and also C4 Aircraft to say, it's important that we also bring in a lot of the royal houses. Now, Prehistoric and pre-colonial, most of our traditional land systems were either in clan or in royal spaces, royalty, king and queen or whatever. Now, these still exists in many parts of Africa, and the cultures determine there's sacred groves. We know that these exist in many places because there's been a tradition of valuing these spaces. So when we brought the Queen of Buganda from the Kingdom of Buganda, she talked about the clans. Why did these clans matter? So when we go in as UN or private sector entities, be it, philanthropic or, all of these different, entities go in to say, oh, we want to support restoring this forest over there. Why do you want to support them? Let's understand their culture. And I say this at the very beginning, the power of language. Language is so critical because with language, when you're going in, people depend on the forest for food systems. People depend on the forest for ceremonies, for rituals. People depend on these ecosystems for health, just mental health. People depend on these ecosystems for fresh air, for aesthetics, and all of that. So in this planning process, this element of inclusivity, even in these programming mechanisms, are so important that everybody is at that table to understand the different roles they play. And a lot of times, and I think now there's a reflection, I think the pandemic has made us reflect a lot. This pandemic has made us reflect that sometimes it's not about the millions of monies that we're going to invest into changing something in there. No, sometimes it's a bit of a shift in the dial in our thinking, even be it a donor, be it a partner, in listening and also having that element of empathy as well. Over.
Thank you so much, Musonda. That's great. I know we're almost at the end of time. Musonda, I want to open the floor to see if you have any final reflections before we close up.
Thank you. I mean, I see the quick question from Daniel, the tenure rights and restoration, and, tenure is critical. Yeah, absolutely. And I see Toko, thank you, Toko. It's actually from Zambia. Is it possible to have the gap between, these forms of knowledge? Absolutely. And I think the IPBES report, I made a reference to the IPBES report. What IPBES report did was bring Indigenous knowledge systems together and also bring the scientific knowledge together. There is a lot to learn from Indigenous people. There's a lot to learn from other forms of knowledge other than just, which is why I gave you this quote that, what you haven't learned is the size of the world. There is so much that we don't know, species that are being discovered right now. But in a final reflection, Yvonne, I just want to say that as we advance forward, I think this year, what I would like to implore everyone, students at Yale, professors and other people beyond Yale, is to be involved in our communities, in our spaces, in our systems, because policies are never changed in a void and in absentia of your being involved. Be it, an electorate, vote, or be part of your community to talk about, improving a forest in your city, a green space, or thinking about specific food systems. Do these make sense? Why are we buying something from, something that's out of season, or something that actually takes up so much water, etc. We have to reflect about our lifestyles, because ultimately it's the culmination of each individual, our individual actions that make us who we are on this planet. So really, even as you think about the restoration agenda, the recovery process of these spaces, most of which have been degraded, but also the conservation of those amazing and beautiful spaces that, we all want to run in, jog in, take our children to, take our pets and dogs. Those spaces have taken time to be where they are, but we should be a part of that process. And I think it's very important that people are in these processes with the leaders that they belong to, et cetera, and also the constituencies that belong to. I'm so excited to have been a part of this, this conference, and I'm really looking forward to reading up on all the deliberations and listening into some of those videos that I missed, and really, really excited. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much again, Musonda. You definitely left us with some powerful insights and some really deep, thought-provoking reflections to do in the near future. So also thank you everyone for coming to this session. Thank you for those that putting questions in the chat. We had some great discussion. So this has been a great session. So we're going to now transition to the announcing of the innovation prize winners as well as closing remarks. So the Zoom link is available on the webpage, and we are going to put it in the chat now. So they'll be announced at 2:30, so in about a minute. And thank you again, Musonda, and we look forward to seeing everyone else at the next session.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.